Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension's hanging. After that, continue on by removing all 4 of your 19mm lug nut covers, then all of your lug nuts. Let's remove the wheel. Let's take one of our lug nuts and we're just going to put it on here to hold the rotor in place for us. Now let's continue on to removing our 30mm axle nut. Now inside this area there's going to be a washer, but we're not super worried about that necessarily. What we are worried about is using a hammer and punch, and we're going to go ahead and separate the axle from the wheel bearing. Just use a magnet, you can pull that off. Now we can move along to removing our upper sway bar link nut. To remove this, we're going to use an 18mm socket. But when you go to turn this counterclockwise, you're going to notice that the entire stud wants to spin. To prevent that, I'll just use some locking pliers right behind the strut on the shaft itself. With the sway bar link off of the strut, we can continue on to our 2 mounting bolts. Now you're going to find 2 mounting bolts that come through from the front towards the rear of the strut that go through the knuckle here. To remove these, there's an 18mm headed nut on each of the bolts. We'll just go ahead and remove that nut and then we can drive this out of here. Inspect your hardware as you remove it. At this point, let's continue on by putting on one of our mounting nuts. We'll put this on a couple good threads. Continue with an 18mm socket and a hammer. Now we're just going to go ahead and drive this right out of here. You're going to watch it come through the front. We'll do the same to this one. Now typically you can grab onto these, we can give this a little wiggle and pull them right out. If it doesn't want to slide out of there, you could also use a hammer and punch right through this area and drive both of them out. Looking at the bolt, you can see the splined area. That's the area that presses directly into the knuckle and holds this in place. You want to give each of these bolts a thorough inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like they're rotted, damaged, or weak in any way. Assuming they look good, you can continue on by setting them aside. Now as we start pulling this down, you need to pay special attention to your axle. That's this area right here. When we bring this down, we want to make sure that we don't put a tug on either of the axle boots, the inboard axle boot or even the outboard axle boot. So while we're bringing this down, we're also going to be pushing the axle through the wheel bearing. There we are. Now let's go ahead and get under the hood. Now from under the hood, you're going to want to look for your strut tower. You're going to have one of these located on each side under the hood. On the top of it, you're going to find 3 studs that come through with a 13mm headed nut that holds it in place. We're going to go ahead and remove all 3 of these nuts, making sure not to touch anything in the center. You do not need to touch the nut in the center. This second one, I'm just going to leave on here a couple threads. We'll fully remove the third. Now I'm going to reach down inside the wheel well, grab onto that strut, and fully remove this nut so I can remove the strut from the wheel well. There it is, friends. Okay, friends, now it's going to be time to get ready to install our brand new front strut. Now I want you to have a look at the top of this. You can tell that the studs form a triangle, but it's not a perfect triangle. They're a little oblonged. So of course you're going to want to make sure that you line it up with the strut tower. We have this area that has the longer bolt separation. You want to make sure that you have the strut in the same orientation. Let's go ahead and take this and we're going to put it right up through the strut tower. Now once you have it up on there, it's a good idea to have some red thread locker on the studs, and then we'll go ahead and put on our brand new nuts. Now we can bottom these out. Now we are going to be torquing these mounting nuts, but we're going to wait until the very end until we can get the full weight of the vehicle back down on the ground. Now let's make our way back into the wheel well. We're going to have a look at our two strut mounting bolts. You can tell that I went ahead and cleaned up the threaded area and the splined area. I put a little bit of red thread locker on each of the mounting bolts. Now let's go ahead and take the knuckle and we're going to put it into place into the strut. We'll move it around a little bit and then we're going to slide our mounting bolts through from the front towards the rear. Just going to get this bottom one started in here. Now at this point, I can go ahead and press this portion in, and that's going to line up the second hole. Start on your two mounting nuts. Once you have both of these mounting nuts started, you can continue on by snugging them up, and then we're going to torque each of them to 89 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and get our washer on here. I always like to have some red thread locker on the threads of the axle. Now we can continue on with our axle nut. Now we're going to go ahead and bottom this out by hand. We'll get the car a little closer to the ground, hold this in place, and then we'll torque it to manufacturer's specification. Now once you have it bottomed out, the next thing you're going to want to do is torque the axle nut to 155. But as you start turning this, it's going to want to turn the entire rotor. So you're going to have to hold that in place. You can either have a second person inside the vehicle stepping on the brake. That's going to squeeze the brake pads up against the rotor and prevent it from moving. If you don't have a second person or just don't feel like it, you can go ahead and use a bar across the lug studs, being very careful not to damage them. Let's get our sway bar link into the strut. Now we can start on our mounting nut. At this point, we'll go ahead and bottom this out, and then we're going to torque this to 59 foot-pounds. And now, you want to go ahead and make sure you do the exact same thing to the other side of the vehicle. Let's get this lug nut off of here. Time to put on the wheel. With the wheel safely on the ground, let's go ahead and torque this to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. If you have a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. You're going to want to pay attention to the valve stem hole. That's the cutout right along here. Line it up with the valve stem. Everything else should line up perfectly along the way. After that, go ahead and take your 19mm socket, and we'll just go ahead and bottom these out. You don't need to use an air gun for this. Now with the wheel back on and the full weight of the vehicle back on the ground, we're going to continue by torquing each of these 13mm headed nuts to 15 foot-pounds.